this segment, we'll discuss key financial implications of and influences on food production systems, available farmland, uses of land, and the costs of food production. And finally, we will examine the differences between large-scale and small-scale farming operations. So, Gary, what do you wish the general public knew about agricultural production?
That's a good question. Basically, one is that people do care about agriculture. Farmers do care about agriculture. Two, though, and this is something that I spend my career at, it's a very stressful financial occupation. There's no farmer that's immune from having their operations suffer a financial setback. And that could be because of, there's the 3Ds, death, disability, and divorce, which causes all small businesses issues. But just the competition for land, renting land is a big deal in the Midwest and across the U.S. And the tension of getting larger, which is something that farmers have to do if they're going to survive and their next generation is going to take over, is a risk that has to be weighed against the comfort of being more settled. And so I don't see any farmer that isn't weighing those risk and returns and making difficult decisions in that framework.
What are the biggest things impacting farmland values?
I feel like I am one of those people who can't quite catch up because there's been the big question for 30 years. Right now, of course, inflation and sustainability and world conflict and big headlines that affect a lot of things in the area we see every single day. We hear Ukraine, and some large percentage of the world's food and fertilizer comes from Ukraine, and we have to deal with that. We see inflation running off the chart and food inflation higher than it's ever been. After the pandemic, we had changed consumer practices and patterns, and people really wanted to know more about their food. So there are all these things that keep emerging at the forefront, and we never really run out of a thing to talk about. What I would say, if there is anything that's changed, it's an understanding that we have to look forward over a longer period of time now. So the period of interest, I guess, is extended, or we're starting to ask questions more about how do we feed a growing population when we hit 9.5 billion or 10 billion? How do we deal with changing consumer preferences when another third of the world's population emerges from poverty and begins to eat a different diet? What do we do with trade, and what do we do with conflict when, in the U.S. in particular, we're a major exporter of agricultural commodities? And that's different. Most countries are not in that way, finding themselves in that position. But more importantly, things like the strength of the dollar. We like to be able to buy a 65-inch TV for $300. And so we think of unidirectional questions at the policy level. But in agriculture, we're exporting. So when we have a strong dollar, that changes the relationship. I think all of these are a bit more available to the general public as a question than they ever have been before. Historically, the joke about where does your food come from the grocery store. That was the typical response. And now I think an understanding that it's a much bigger and more integrated system has become kind of the norm.
Farmers are facing a lot of pressures and constraints from the consolidation of land and how they are forced to farm. So this kind of industrial agriculture model that we're currently stuck in. And so, we know that more kind of diverse agricultural landscapes are better. So whether that includes cover crops or, you have islands of forests or whatever it is, more diverse landscapes are better. And yet we're stuck in this system where we have intense incentives to monocrop and to work in this kind of large scale over, the economies of scale, and so work thousands of acres as opposed to working kind of smaller, more productive farms in a diversity sense.
What do you say when folks talk about being concerned about larger and larger operations taking over production,
Yeah.
livestock sectors?
Yep. So it is. So again, I'll go back to my childhood. When I was a high schooler growing up, many of my friends were in agriculture, and there was 5 to 6 operations now where there's one. And that isn't something that anybody wants, because there's fewer and fewer individuals involved in it. Having said that, the technology is driving you in that direction, and the primary beneficiary of that is consumers. And there's a famous economic theory called the Cochrane treadmill theory that says as farmers adopt technology, what they do is first they increase their incomes, but as everybody adopts it, supply increases and actually farm incomes go down because of more supply. So it's fundamentally good for consumers that there's fewer farmers. And that we have the technology in the grain sector to continue that consolidation 50 years, just the way it is. On the livestock side, we have seen firms, well, the hog industry in this state is a prime example. It used to be many independents. Now you can list the number of large firms that control pork on 2 hands, maybe 3, and that makes everybody uncomfortable. Having said that, if you look at the people that are involved in those large operations, they're very good. I mean, and we have a number in Illinois that are part of the ones that have made it through, that are very good operations, care about their animals, care about the people that are involved with that. And again, overall, it's probably been good from a consumer perspective. Large integrated operations produce pork, poultry less expensively than smaller operations, and do it in a pretty consistent manner.
Quality, consistent, safe.
Yeah. Quality, consistent, safe. And despite what people think, the animals are treated pretty well. I mean, if you look at the hogs that my family raised, and I grew up on a hog farm, and we were a small operation, they received the same care in a large integrated operation compared to what we gave them. So there's not even really animal welfare concerns. It is large, though.
In regard to both crop and animal production systems, both at large and small scales, some of our key considerations are who has access to land? Who makes decisions about how land is used?
I think that we have markets currently that have been, they're artificially constructed, and so not enough people have access to land, right? We're allowing too many either large companies, large farmers, right? And this is the real concern that we're also seeing in places like Colombia, where you have, the everyday subsistence is off small scale and kind of medium scale agriculture. Mm-hmm. And we're increasingly turning to these models where very few people hold a lot of land and a lot of resources. And so what would happen if we open that up, if we gave more access and we didn't create barriers to, for example, people of color or people who we don't think of as traditional farmers, if they had access to that land again, right? And there were incentives to produce more kind of diverse cropping systems, right? The markets that we have are a social construction, and we can change the way that it's constructed, but we often don't. And so why is that? I think that's a really important question that I don't think you really need to ask of farmers themselves, because I'm not entirely sure that's in their control, right? They're responding to these things. These are broader policy questions of, right, why do we still continue to provide insurance in the way we do or subsidies in the way we do when we know diverse systems are better? We know that Indigenous peoples, people of color, have been literally locked out of farming. I mean, these were, long experience, or like lots of experience in farming and agriculture, in the U.S. or the North American context, right? But we constructed policies that locked these groups out of essentially land ownership and the ability to pursue farming. And so, right, if we reconceived of who has access to land, who has the resources to make those lands productive, right? We know USDA has long racist policies of providing loans to predominantly white farmers. And so I think we have this narrative in our head that this is the most profitable and productive model for agriculture, but we don't really have evidence to say that other models aren't similarly productive. So I don't think there has to be that trade-off, but there has to be a will to, go and look at those things and ask those questions and be able to collect the data to say, we could be just as profitable if we chose another way, right? And I don't think there is that trade-off either with Illinois culture, right? I think Illinois farmers would love to have their family farms back, right? Yeah. I think Wisconsin dairy farmers would love to have their dairy cows back.
So do you think the fear might be that ownership is power, and it's sort of who holds the power of access, whether it be land, the meat industry, one or two corporations in the meat industry, et cetera, et cetera?
Sure.
Is that a reasonable?
Clearly. And media went through that a few years ago. We do that. We have a very concentrated banking system actually in the U.S. We have very concentrated production of automobiles. We have very few competitors with iPhone and Samsung's Galaxy. So there are cases where that can accumulate. There are also cases where you don't want a lot of different producers of something, where there's standardization or public products involved. And in the food system, it's a great internal tension, right? We want to make sure that we can get food distributed everywhere fairly and in a way that is economically important for people. And what structure of ownership would most promote that, I think, is a really fair question.
There's a lot to unpack in this segment as we investigate the economics of food production in both the livestock and crop industries and access to land. As you reflect on this module, I challenge you to consider the following questions. Who or what are the political and social influences on the various elements of the food system? How can we utilize available land resources and technology to produce more high-quality food for the world? What measures can we put into practice that will allow farmers to increase productivity while improving the environmental health of the planet?